what I should say, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever applies in your case, good something worldwide, to this almost last session of SRA 2022. And thanks to all of you for attending. I'm very pleased to introduce Sihem Amer-Yahia as our last keynote speaker today. Sihem used to be a student in my university some years ago. And since that, she did a brilliant career all around the world. And she's now a CNRS senior researcher at Laboratoire d'Informatique de Grenoble in France. She is a silver medal of the CNRS, which is a very high distinction of the French, let's say, scientific community. She used to be, before that, in Yahoo Research and in other places. And Sihem worked on data management, advanced data management. She's behind the XML standards worldwide. And she recently works on fairness in data management. So I suppose she was going to talk to us on this research topic, and precisely, if I understood correctly, on fairness in online labor markets. So Sihem, you have the floor. Please, everybody, remember that we are recording. In case you don't want to be recorded, shut down your camera and send your questions to the chat, and the facilitators will take care of that and we will forward it. So Sihem, you have the floor for the next 25 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexi. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to tell you about this work. And I pre-recorded myself because I'm sitting in a hotel room in Philadelphia, and I just wanted to make sure the recording goes through. The recording will last about 20 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for questions, discussions. So that's it. So please go ahead with the recording.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. My name is Sihem Amer-Yahia, and I'm a CNRS research director, and I work at the University of Grenoble-Alpes in France. I'm going to tell you today about fairness on online labor markets. So online labor markets are web destinations where one finds work. Work is in the form of open calls to hire cheap, immediate, skilled, and easily accessible labor online. There are a number of online labor markets. Crowdsourcing platforms is one family where work is in the form of micro tasks such as image labeling, and characterized by the fact that they're completed by a single worker at once, and collaborative tasks where a set of individuals collaborate and work together. There's also freelancing marketplaces where work is in the form of micro gigs, such as hiring someone to prepare a resume for you, or somebody to come to your place and fix your plumbing. These freelancing marketplaces serve as intermediaries between workers and job providers. And there are many, many such platforms. TaskRabbit is an American platform. Kappa is a platform here in Grenoble. And then also the big giants provide such a service. So what is discrimination at work? So discrimination happens at different stages. It can happen at the time of hiring. It can happen during the term of an individual, for instance, for a promotion, or it could happen also at compensation time. And discrimination has been studied and legislated in the physical world for many, many years. It is defined as the unbalanced targeting of workers based on their protected attributes. And it's defined this way in different countries. And for instance, in the French criminal law, there are 25 protected attributes, including gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And what characterizes online labor markets is that they blur the boundary between physical and virtual worlds, making it difficult to determine what is the text of law that applies in their context. In fact, from a legal perspective, digital platforms in general serve as an interface between more than two economic players, and which means that a number of texts of law become applicable. What also makes them challenging is the fact that one needs to observe an offense to make a case in a court of law in terms of discrimination. And to observe, we need to quantify. So in fact, in France, France is one of the early places in the world where there has been a push and an effort to create legislation or around these platforms. And the consumer code in France includes a legal definition of online platform operators, and that considers platforms not only as an interface between economic players, but also as an intermediary between the state and the public. And so this allows the state to create legislation. For instance, one recent legislation requires platforms to provide information to their users on how recommendation algorithms work, which in itself is a very small step towards better legal protection for individuals. So these platforms make it very challenging to protect people at work, because we do not have a direct relationship between employers and employees. There is sort of this intermediation that needs to become a legal entity that around which texts of law need to be defined. And so the farthest this has gone is by requiring these platforms to become transparent, to make transparent the treatment of workers or the logic of their algorithms. But we know from a technical perspective that this is not enough to protect individuals, or at least, or even to help them quantify the level of discrimination they may experience. In fact, in this case, it's all about ranking. It's all about studying discrimination in ranking individuals, at least as a first step in terms of studying discrimination in hiring. So this is a screenshot of Kappa, where I'm searching for a web designer and maybe setting an additional, some additional conditions. And then what I get to see is a ranked list of people that the algorithm is deemed relevant to the search. So obviously, because of the ranking, people who appear at the top of this ranking are more likely, are more exposed, and are more likely to get examined by potential job providers and get hired. So if we sort of simplify the discourse, what we're having here is there is sort of as input we have a query and a set of workers, and the output is a ranking of workers, right? And each worker can be described with a set of protected attributes, but also, some inferred attributes, such as, the approval rating of the jobs that this worker has completed in the past, some results of tests, and so on. Right? And to rank individuals, one can think of there are ranking scoring functions or ranking logics that assign for a given search query, because it very much depends on the query itself, a score to individuals, and then the ranking will be based on that score. And the point of giving this example function is to show that, even if the function itself is made transparent and is shown to be expressed only using inferred attributes, there may be correlations in the data that basically result in favoring some groups of individuals over others, right? And so here we're interested in studying group fairness, where a group is defined as a combination of values or protected attributes. So there's actually, there was a piece of work a few years back by some colleagues who looked at TaskRabbit and asked the following questions. How do perceived gender and race influence the ratings and reviews workers receive? Because on TaskRabbit, job providers or customers of TaskRabbit can write reviews and ratings, thumbs up, thumbs down, after a job is completed by a worker. They also ask the question of, are there differences in the language of the reviews for workers of different genders and races? And finally, they ask the ranking discrimination question, which is, do workers' demographics correlate with their position in search results? So to study discrimination on online labor markets, and because we don't have access to the input data and we don't have access to the logic of ranking or the algorithm that ranks workers, we go about it by running queries and scraping the rankings, the ranked list of workers that are returned for each query. Sometimes one needs to enrich the data because it has some partial information, in particular demographics, and then quantify discrimination using a number of discrimination measures. So that is what was done in this work. So the data is from 1 month in 2015, and it contained 3,700 workers, 12% of which didn't have demographics. So the profile images of those workers were crowdsourced to Amazon Mechanical Turk to label them with gender and race information based on the profile picture. And as a result, there was about half women, half men, and kind of a skewed distribution of ethnicity, 70% white, and then the rest, distributed among Blacks and Asians. And here are the findings. So the first one is that perceived, and I'm saying perceived because it's based on the profile picture, but perceived white women receive 10% fewer reviews than men with equivalent work experience. The second observation is that Black men receive significantly lower ratings than others with similar attributes. And the same similar experiment was conducted on Fiverr, another platform. And there, it was also observed that, for instance, only workers with no image received lower ratings than Blacks, okay? And that the language of reviews contains significantly more negative adjectives for Black workers, okay? And to answer the second and third question, there was also a study of the rankings and the positions of people with different race and gender information in the rankings. And it was found that the ranking algorithm produces results that are significantly correlated with race and gender, although the specific groups that are ranked lower change from city to city. But the important thing here is that there is a significant correlation with race and gender. A plausible explanation is that the ranking algorithm is designed to account for customer feedback, meaning for the ratings, reviews, and clicks on profiles, and learns to adjust the ranking of individuals based on that feedback. And so if there is bias in customer feedback, it implicitly causes the search algorithm to exhibit bias in the ranking of different groups, race and gender groups. So let's take a step back and look at how we can design a model that can be then used to study discrimination in sort of a larger setting and across multiple platforms. So on any given platform, any given site, we can consider, or we can model, represent a set of labeled groups, right? Where the groups are labeled, are described by their protected attributes, a set of locations, and a set of job-related queries, such as home cleaning or logo design. And so what we did here is we defined the discrimination value of a triple group, query, meaning job search, and location, as the aggregated, in this case, the average distance between the rankings of individuals in the group of interest, G, and all its variant or all groups that are comparable to it. Okay, so as an example, if we're interested in quantifying the discrimination of Black females for home cleaning services in San Francisco, we would build, in this case, a histogram of the distribution of rankings of Black females in the search result for this query, and compare it to all its sort of variant or comparable attributes along the protected attribute dimensions. For instance, Black females against Black males for gender, and Black females against Asian females and white females for ethnicity. By aggregating this, we can associate a single discrimination value to Black females for home cleaning in San Francisco. Now, how do we actually compute these values that are aggregated? So at the bottom, I'm showing EMD, which is what I just showed, which is computing the distance between the distributions of rankings of individuals in the groups. But we can also leverage, for instance, other measures such as exposure, which is going to compute the difference between the exposure, the aggregated exposure of individuals, that is a function of their rank, and their relevance in the search query. So this allows us, the fact that we are able to associate to a triple GQL a discrimination value allows us to go one step further and define a number of categories of questions we may be interested in. So worker fairness is going to examine how groups are treated by the platform, and for instance, answer questions such as which two groups TaskRabbit is the most unfair for. Job fairness is going to help us focus on specific jobs and answer questions such as what are the 5 least discriminating jobs for Asian males at all locations. And finally, location fairness is going to help us answer questions such as, out of a number of locations, what is the least discriminating for women looking for an event staffing job? And this is important because once we're able to associate a value to a triple, then we can build indices that we can then use to aggregate information on the fly to answer these types of questions. And that's what we did. And for instance, that what allowed us to have a certain number of results that are present in a moment. And in fact, to do that, we did basically this scraping, running a number of job search queries, getting answers, getting ranked results, then scraping basically those results from TaskRabbit, and then crowdsourcing the worker photos for those for which we could not get the demographics information, assigning gender and ethnicity to those photos, and then running our different worker fairness, job fairness, and location fairness queries. And as a result, here I'll show you some of our results. And the top left corner, you can see that Asian females, for instance, are the most discriminated against. White males are the least discriminated against. And the results are, the two measures, EMD and exposure, largely agree. We can also do a job fairness query where we examine the most discriminatory job or the least discriminatory job, and then the most discriminatory city in the bottom of the least discriminatory city. Okay, of course, then we can combine all these different dimensions and do aggregations across multiple lists, and to be able to run more sophisticated quantifications. This is important because this is what lets us claim that we have a tool at the disposal of job providers and also obviously workers to study or at least to determine or quantify discrimination on different platforms. Okay, so there's a number of open questions, obviously, that this that this framework, enables. One is to look at the data in a sort of a longer term, right? So, rather than just take a snapshot of the data, run a longitudinal observational study of worker behavior over time. For instance, we could ask the question of, do adverse working conditions for a certain group cause them to drop out of the freelancing workforce at greater rates than men? We can also ask questions about, does do the conditions, the working conditions, or at least the hiring conditions of a certain group change over time, okay, by quantifying discrimination over time. So the second aspect is repair. Obviously, when one cannot talk about discrimination without, thinking about how to repair it. And in fact, in discrimination in ranking, there are really three different stages at which one could intervene to fix discrimination. When we have access to the input data, we could intervene on the data itself, because the discrimination may exhibit itself because of a skewed distribution. We could also intervene on the ranking logic of the ranking function when we have access to it. Or intervene, after the ranking is returned and re-rank the results, right? And this is relevant to online labor markets, because we don't have access to input data nor to the algorithm, and so re-ranking would be a good way of addressing or repairing discrimination. And one could think of it as, what is for a given query, or for a given set of queries, or for a given location, what is the, how do we re-rank the results that are returned by a platform to reduce the disparities, or to reduce the discrimination for a given group, or among a set of groups. More generally, if we take a step back, there was a piece of work some time ago, more than 10 years ago, where workers were given several tasks to choose from, and chose tasks, and then they were to complete on a crowdsourcing platform, and then they were asked what was their motivation? Why did they choose some tasks? Here we can see that payment is one of the motivating factors, but there are also a number of other factors, including, for instance, human capital advancement. So in fact, some workers chose to complete tasks because they considered that those tasks help them improve, for instance, their skills. And so this leads us to other open questions that take into consideration what motivates workers on these platforms, and develop tools to help them choose or at least examine their performance. For instance, how am I performing compared to others? How am I growing compared to others? Right? How are my skills evolving, or my competencies evolving when compared to others? And more generally, this is in the context of future of work, where we as researchers have the responsibility of studying these platforms, also developing safeguards, and perceiving sort of the future of work as a place where humans are empowered by getting help from a mix of humans and AI machines, enhancing their capabilities through upskilling or human capital advancement while feeling safe. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.
Okay, thanks Sihem, for this very nice talk. We now have the floor open for questions.
Okay, that's wonderful. Okay, I'm connected from
please
my
raise your hand in case you and I will give you the floor as you raise the hands. Sure, Sihem was very clear and everybody understand everything. So Fred, you are the first to have a question. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Sam. That was a really interesting talk. A lot of stuff there that I was not aware of. Can you give us some idea of how big this online labor market has become and how rapidly it's growing?
Oh, all right. Well, thanks for the question. I don't have numbers, for that, but what I know is that the pandemic has obviously played a major role in, people working remotely and accepting that people work remotely, and that why in fact initially when these platforms started, Amazon Mechanical Turk was one of the precursors. They were targeting. I mean, there was no specific domain or specific area or specific type of task that was targeted, and then slowly, more domain-specific platforms were developed. And for instance, platforms that are used mainly for citizen science or mainly for data annotation. I think one of the biggest growing area in the last maybe 5 years is the use of these platforms solely for generating data to train AI algorithms. Right, and an example is Figure 8, which was a newer incarnation of a platform that was initially built on top of a Mechanical Turk. And Figure 8 solely specializes in hiring people to annotate data, and then obviously, the annotations are used for training AI algorithms. The other evolution of these platforms is an example of that evolution is a prolific academic that is a platform that's based in the UK, and where their their claim is that they gather very precise information, very detailed information on their workers, both demographics, but also their performance on these platforms. And so their selling point is that they make hiring and targeting sets of workers much easier, since the information is used for targeting purposes. And then the more recent development is freelancing platforms, where basically these are just intermediaries to hire people, or rather than going through a physical sort of agency for being hired, you go online. And Kappa, for instance, is such an example. And their use of algorithms is first for hiring. Basically, you submit all your credentials and paperwork online, and they use heavily, OCR and to examine the CV automatically, to examine your, all sorts of, paperwork automatically, and then sort of scale up the very first stage, like the qualification process. So the evolution has been in, like starting off with general purpose platforms, and then sort of becoming more and more specialized towards specific goals. The other evolution I'm aware of, there is work at NYU Stern, where they have been studying the where do workers come from, and so initially workers were based in Asia, in India in particular, Pakistan, but the population has grown, and the diversity has grown tremendously in the past 10 years, covering different parts of the world. So I hope this answers at least partially to your question.
Yes, it's amazing how widespread this already is. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely sort of this easy accessibility, and this is the reason why we started a few years back, including Alexi was involved in the project, asking the question of understanding the impact of those platforms on people, both from a legal perspective and another sort of more, social and humanities kind of questions. Yeah.
Liz, you have a question?
Yes, you in your work, you found that online platforms basically reflect the biases of society. I'm wondering if you could speculate about some of the possible opportunities for beginning to change some of these problems, like, for example, through thinking through the design of such systems based on your work.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So, clearly this question of, exposure of groups of individuals, whether you call it discrimination or bias, is something that is not, that should not be sort of studied in, sort of in silo, right? I mean, obviously, there are many reasons, right, that go far back into sort of rooted in society and rooted in the data itself and rooted in the opportunities that are offered to people much earlier, right? Both in sort of their training and their ability to basically to get hired, So my take on this is that the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we provide the ability, provide the flexibility and the expressivity that is needed, for understanding first what the impact of those platforms are, both from sort of an individual perspective, right? So, for instance, the way people are approaching, getting hired on those platforms is, by really sort of doing all the work of exposing themselves, right? So, in a study we did 2 years back, we were simply trying to figure out, what was the motivation of individuals and what is it that they were trying to expose about themselves. And one thing that was highly apparent was that they were trying to get as much exposure to different job providers as possible for the same job, right? Because they knew that it is exposure that matters, right? That, but that was done, that is still done with great effort from the workers' part, in the sense of, like, I log in, I add my credentials here, then I go to another platforms, then I go to another one, and then I'm waiting to get approved, to do the job. So adding a layer that helps people to, first understand, what is the likelihood of getting a job somewhere, understand, creating fluidity between different job opportunities for people is extremely important. So that's from a job seeker's perspective. There's also the perspective of the legislators or the auditors, right? There is no way for, say, the European Commission, for instance, in Europe, to tell you, okay, what if I'm going to be defining sort of providing sort of like a stamp, like saying, this platform, is validated by the, European Commission because it satisfies, it does not violate at least a certain number of principles, right? And to be able to do that, there is a need for, tools that reason about the data of people on top of those platforms and how they're treated by them. So that's in terms of what we can do as computer scientists, right? Is really to sort of build, sort of these layers that help, and even job providers themselves, right? A job provider, doesn't know if, he or she wants to deploy a certain number of jobs, doesn't know, which platform to target, right? To satisfy a certain number of requirements in terms of how people are treated, right? So as computer scientists, we can do that. But obviously, this is only sort of one part of the process, right? It is about providing opportunities from very early on. It's about the training, which is the point I was making at the end. It's about upskilling. It's about getting to a point where we are exploiting these platforms to go beyond sort of the hurdles in the physical world, right? So that's I guess that's that's how I see it today.
Thank you.
Kathy, you have a question?
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you so much, Sihem. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I have a question about intervening in systems, intervening in the gig economy and gig economy platforms. I was really interested in the way that you laid out the ways to intervene. So we could intervene at the data level, we could intervene at the algorithm level. One of the things that I was thinking about when you outlaid the mechanisms to intervene in the system was, what are the incentives for the online platform providers? So they control the algorithm, they control the platform. How do we influence, or how do we incentivize the platform providers towards broader notions of fairness?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. So I think the platforms today invest a lot of resources in trying to stay ahead of the curve in terms of what is it that this part of the world is going to regulate, okay? And all of that is done through, like basically hiring people who are skilled, in terms of understanding different texts of law and understanding how to, let me say, sort of circumvent, some of the requirements that sort of these evolving text of laws all over the world are putting on them. And so I think that's an incentive, for those platforms. Clearly, if we get to a point in the future where some platforms are going to be accepted, more than others, simply because they can show, right, that they're more inclusive, right? Then that's a big incentive, right? And that's clearly something that I think platform designers are after, sort of being able to project themselves into a future where they're able to say, see, this is what I'm able, how I'm able to comply with new regulations. Now, so more specifically, let's say you want to intervene on the data, right? So what is a data intervention? So data intervention can be seen as studying all the possible worlds, all the projections of data, all the subsets of data within which exposure of some in particular minorities, of some underrepresented groups is higher than others, right? And it's something, from a sort of a technical perspective, it's really quite simple to grasp, because the reason why some groups are more exposed than others, right, is that they simply, it's a question of numbers, right? I mean, like when there are much fewer people who in a certain group, obviously because of ranking, right, they won't appear. They're less likely to appear and be exposed. So what we're doing here with ranking, okay, is comparing apples and oranges in a sense, right? Or comparing the incomparable. So if we're able to say, you know what, I'm going to focus on this subset, this possible world, which is a subset of the data, and run the job search on this subset of the data and not on everything together, then I'm going to likely, expose certain subgroups of individuals. So if that's simply that, right? It's a form of affirmative action in a way, right? If you could see it that way. Simply that is a huge claim that these platforms could make, that I'm, able to implement, affirmative action on my platform. So I think incentives can be seen more from the perspective of what is their alternative today, right? Putting, armies of lawyers versus enabling technology that is sort of a bit more expressive and richer in terms of exposing individuals.
Liz, I see that we are practically, that we consumed our time. Do you allow me to make a last comment to Sihem?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, an option we could explore, no, ranking algorithms are based on the idea that we compare what we rank between them. So we compare X to Y so that we can build up a ranking. Now, instead of doing a ranking procedure, if we use a rating procedure in which we don't compare the objects between them, but we compare them to a standard, to a norm. No? So you say this is a 5-star worker, 4-star worker, 3-star worker, 3, etc., etc. No, that could introduce a different way to consider a problem. Now, I don't want you to reply to that because unfortunately we totally run out of time. I will essentially thank Sihem for this very nice talk, this thought-provoking talk. I will thank everybody for attending this talk. I understand that we have 8 minutes of break. Liz, correct me.
We'll give ourselves 10 minutes. It'll be fine. And Sihem, if you did want to respond to that, you're welcome to. We'll just shift the break a little bit.
All right.
Okay. Thank you in any case.
Very briefly, thank you for the question and thank you for being here. So just very briefly, I agree with you, Alexi. I think that obviously, what we should find other ways of presenting information online. I mean, people are so used to ranking, right? That it's very hard to kind of move on to a different way of presenting the information. But in a piece of work I did when I was at Yahoo on sort of matchmaking sort of platforms, right? We tried to do something like that. I mean, it was not based on rating, but instead of you're looking for a date, and instead of returning people just like ranked based on the criteria you put in, we would actually group them, right? And we would put them in different different groups, and we would say, if you want to go for this criterion or this set of criteria, you should look into this group and you should dive into this group. But if you're more interested in this other set of criteria, you should dive into this other group, right? And from a technical perspective, you can see that as multi-objective optimization and navigating in a sort of a Pareto, because obviously that's right. And I mean, I think one needs to bring that. I mean, from an algorithmic and technical solution perspective, there are many solutions. But then, how do you bring that to what is sort of how do you render that information to users, and how do you enable interactive interactivity, to explore that data I think is a great research area.
Okay, thanks again, everybody. And
thank you.
I leave now to Liz for arranging the rest. Thanks, everybody.